Welcome back to Night Watch, and welcome back to our consideration of what it means with the collapse of communism within the Soviet Union and what we used to call the Eastern Bloc. What does it mean now, not just to the Soviet Union, but the rest of the world? What does it mean that we now have essentially one great power, and for the moment at any rate, one great ideology? Does it make any difference?
I think it's going to mean a loss of democratic rights in some of the other former socialist countries. While they were socialist and authoritarian and politically not democracies, there were economic democratic rights, as just mentioned. And we now find that the women in East Germany are finding abortion less accessible, divorce less accessible. They're not finding jobs. They're being laid off from jobs. No more daycare benefits. So there are going to be real losses and hardships for people in those countries. In the rest of the world, in much of the third world, I think, Ask the ANC, Nelson Mandela, and they got a lot of aid from the old Soviet Union, aid that was essential in fighting apartheid and in fighting fascism. And any number of movements from Central America to Asia to Africa were assisted in their struggles for national liberation. And they are now suffering and will feel the effects. Not only have these countries stopped this aid, but they've switched sides. So you had the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Poles sending troops to fight against Iraq with the U.S. In the Allied force. So there's a real shift of power here to those who have against those who have not.
There's a real perception throughout the third world that Du Bois's prediction, W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, argued that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. He was referring to segregation in the United States and colonialism in Africa and Latin America. Now in the 21st century, we're seeing a new kind of color line that goes from Vladivostok all the way over to Vancouver, uniting what had formerly been the Soviet bloc, unfortunately, behind the forces of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, as it approaches a new type of exploitation toward Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, and Asia.
But, you know, let me ask you something about that, because I've noted that position in other places. It's as though China doesn't exist when we have a conversation like this. This is a nation of over 1 billion people, which still calls itself a communist regime. Is it ceased to be a factor in the world? Or is it ever been a factor? Or will it be a factor?
I think it was a factor in the early 60s because it also played a role, particularly in Africa, of developing relationships to freedom struggles in Africa. But since actually, since the Nixon administration and beyond, it's made its peace with the United States. You can see that in the Tiananmen developments, where Bush went very lightly on the quashing of these democratic rights in China.
But is communism dead inside China?
No. Well, let's put it this way. There's a post-capitalist economic system, I believe, in China, also undemocratic, which may, in fact, make the transition, it's potentially possible, that Gorbachev was trying to make, which is sort of a marketized Stalinism. The bureaucracy maintains its power, but slowly introduces capitalist mechanisms.
The United States, despite its democratic rhetoric, is less concerned about democracy in the third world and more concerned about having political institutions in these countries that will guarantee that American corporations can take out their profits and take those back to the United States. They're more concerned about creating the conditions of an unpaid, underpaid, and non-unionized labor force. Right. And whether those political systems go by the name communist or not, I think is secondary to the basic dynamic of exploitation.
This explains Bush's so-called inconsistency that is very emphatic that Cuba should have democratic rights and the Soviets, but very soothing with the Chinese and say, let's not have a litmus test, let's not try to push them,
because
let them come on.
Because
they're giving him what he wants in terms of investments and cheap labor and all that stuff.
I think...
And that's really the thing. The Soviets have had political democratic reforms, but he's still calling for more reforms, more reforms. It's market, that's what he wants.
Well, let me ask all three of you then. What nation in the world today would you say comes closest to what you would hope a socialist, a communist state would be?
This is what we're always faulted for. I can readily say, unfortunately, none. You know, there are societies that no longer are run by capitalist economies, like such as ours, where 1% of the population owns 90% of the wealth. This wealth has been statized, but because of the lack of democratic rights, I would have to say that I'd like to separate the word socialism from these existing post-capitalist societies. These are revolutions that ran into a brick wall, in my opinion, by and large, in taking the system further towards socialism. But also what I would like to say is I agree that the U.S. is in a unipolar world now and can pretty much call the shots, and that's very frightening to people in the third world. And it's going to pit the East Europeans against people of color. It's no accident that they forgive Poland's debt immediately while they keep the debt burden on the countries in Latin America. That's not an accident. But we should remember this. This is not the post-Second World War world. U.S. economy is exhausted. It isn't Bretton Woods. It isn't a period where we have a growth rate and an ability to expand in the United States that existed in the Second World War.
Excuse me, are we exhausted? I thought I was just hearing that we were, in fact, now sort of the ogre of the world.
Well, but it's a little shallower than it was in 1947.
Rome was a mighty empire, and just at the height of its military power and scope, it was also at the beginning of its decline.
Right. Military power, it doesn't make for economic power in the world.
That's right. But I also think that another point has to be made, that looking at this from the vantage point of democratic movements inside of the United States, particularly the civil rights movement, that with a bipolar world, this contradiction between capitalism and communism, those who favored the desegregation of American society were able to use that against the American government at the United Nations and throughout the forums of world opinion, because the United States was concerned about how it looked vis-a-vis communism in the third world.
Now we're free, you say, to be repressive?
Yes.
It creates...
Or indifferent.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's really the phrase here. It creates fewer opportunities for domestic movements for reform, and that's the irony, because no democratic activist in this country ever wholly embraced the Leviathan that we saw in the Soviet Union.
But question though, if you are of your persuasion, you still have to have some example, some guiding star. You say, this is what I want to be, and I ask both of you, what is it?
Well, can I answer? Could I
quickly
question your question?
Yes.
Is there a country where you would, you see, there may be no country where there may be no candidates you exactly love perfectly, completely, but you vote for someone
Why doesn't
anyway.
anybody ever ask what capitalist country is the perfect one?
Right.
Well, I think a lot of people answer that.
No, but I think the Cubans have a right to make their own mistakes and develop along their own way. I think the Vietnamese have a right to do those things. I think the Angolans do, the Mozambicans and all. So there are a lot of countries where those things are going on, and I can go in and say, I don't like your bureaucracy, you're a little uptight here, and you should be more this and more emphasis on that. But the point is, they have to do their own system. And what we oppose, I think we all agree on, is the U.S. going in and dictating to these countries.
That's right.
You don't set out, you're not enough of an obedient client state, we're going to zap you. I mean, what they did to Iraq, which was a right-wing nationalist country, wasn't even socialist or communist or anything like that, because this guy wanted to cut a better deal on the oil, to go in and bomb and kill that number of people, to dictate in that manner, is just horrible, and it's a disgrace to our country, and it's a violation of the laws of humanity.
And we are going to have, for a moment, leave disgrace and violations. We will be back in a second with Night Watch.